Okay, we're live. Welcome to Dive into Worldbuilding, where I have spiky purple hair and everybody is a little bit, I don't know, we had trouble getting into the hangout today. Google is pulling tricks on us, I think. But I'm happy to have you, and we're talking about idioms. Idioms. So idioms are basically expressions, right? Like when you say, don't let the cat out of the bag, and you don't mean it literally. So there are lots and lots of them, but I think actually there are a couple of interesting things about them. Okay, and one of them is that they tend to chunk together. You tend not to be able to, for example, let the elephant out of the bag and have it mean the same thing. So there are some expressions that you can change things, and some expressions you can't change things, right? It's interesting. You know, like what the fill in the blank, right?
Yeah.
There are several options that you can fill that blank in with. Right? Or you can leave it empty, as we have seen.
Yes.
I don't think that those particular characteristics are necessarily helpful, but one of the things that you can do is take advantage of those little fill-in-the-blank spots when you're in. Oh yeah, Proverbs totally count. Well, we're going to go there totally. Okay. But you can substitute things in, and sometimes when you're in a fictional world, substituting things in is really fun. So do you guys have examples of things that you like, or things that you've done, or anything like that you want to mention?
It's hard. Question.
Mm-hmm.
Does a construction like sick as a dog, is that an idiom? Because you are talking about being sick. That part's literal.
Right. Yes, that's an expression.
Okay.
Because sick as the dog tends to clump together, right? You couldn't say, oh, I'm as sick as a snake.
Yeah.
Because then people would be going, but how are you as sick as a snake? What is snake-like about your illness, right? Whereas if you say you're as sick as a dog, nobody goes, oh, well, how are dogs ill, precisely?
It's just accepted.
What about your malady resembles that of a dog? So yeah, sick as a dog is a good one. Absolutely. And so literal, yeah. So it's not even in literal. There's a certain type of literality that it doesn't have, right? So yes, it means you're sick, but it's not actually a contentful simile, I guess you could say, right?
Yeah.
Because what will happen over time is sometimes words will tend to lose meaning, right? Or their meaning will kind of fade or become less dramatic. Or it'll just change in other ways. I mean, so terrific used to be like terrible, right?
Awesome, entirely different.
Yeah, awesome used to be completely different. So things do change over time. And then there are things that are like, yeah, so a simile without content, sort of, is the way that I would explain it.
Yeah.
We're not.
But it also sort of like does have like a cultural meaning specific to that. You know, like American sayings like "kick the bucket."
Yeah.
Is not going to universally translate. If you go somewhere else, they'll have something else for that sort of, you know, oh, he's going to die, he's going to kick the bucket, you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all you have to do is watch that Monty Python sketch to get some really great euphemistic expressions of death.
I have not watched Monty Python.
Pushing up the daisies, or
yeah.
you know, like, or shuffled off this mortal coil and joined the choir invisible, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
A very long time ago in high school Spanish class, so I'm not sure how accurate this is,
yeah.
I was told that what we would say pulling my leg, in Spanish you translate it as pulling my hair.
Huh. I should go look that up.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, pulling my leg. So basically what has happened is, in a sense, that the words that make up the idiomatic phrase have sort of clumped together in a way, so that their individual meanings as words are less important than what they signify as a chunk.
Yeah.
Okay? I think that's what we're really dealing with. Because if you try to parse it out, then what you get is not quite what you thought you were going to get.
Yeah.
So we have tons of these. Out of the blue, for example.
I read a good book that it had a couple examples. It was The Great Wall of Lucy Wu, and it's a middle grade contemporary. And her parents make her go to Chinese school.
Okay.
And the first thing they end up studying are like these proverbs, and they have to like act out the stories behind the proverbs.
Okay.
To get to like understand the expression. And one of the expressions was, and I'm gonna get the directions wrong, but it was like sleep in the west, eat in the east, or something, right? Or like vice versa.
Right.
And it was like the original story was like a guy had one wife who could cook and one wife who was really pretty. So he'd go eat with the one wife who could cook and go sleep with the wife who was really pretty. And as the kids were talking about it, Lucy Wu points out that it's basically like kind of like, the American would be like, have your cake and eat it too.
Right.
So it's interesting that like, you don't it's like that these things change, and there is, at least in some places, people know the original story.
Yeah.
That gave rise to it.
Yeah. Do you happen to know a story behind have your cake and eat it too?
Nope. That one remains a mystery.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these things do have stories behind them, and it actually reminds me of that Star Trek episode, Darmok, right?
Yeah.
People would use these expressions, and they were directly references to these stories that nobody had ever heard. so
yeah.
Of course you couldn't figure out what they meant because,
They didn't know the stories, yeah.
Right, exactly, because if you don't know the story behind it, it makes no sense at all, and you're like, I am not sure what you're talking about.
That was a good episode, because, like, their universal translator was giving them, like, this literal translation, so all the words were coming out, but none of the meanings were, because nobody had been able to, like, penetrate their culture far enough to figure out what the stories were.
Yeah, so this is where I have to do my requisite plug for my very first analog story, because I was not entirely satisfied with the way that they set up the cultural background for Darmok, and so I actually took the same language concept and did my own thing with it. And it was all about how you were trying to find the place where the stories were actually told. Right?
Yeah.
Because there really was... The problem with the Star Trek episode was there was no sense of whether, or much less where, these stories would actually be learned and told and that kind of thing. And in some sense, you could say, well, maybe it's just that transparent. The stories aren't told anymore. right? Because you can have that, but I struggled with it. You know, could you learn that sort of a language solely from context? Possibly, but But some of the ways that they were explaining it in the episode were like, really, are you sure?
Yeah.
I mean, I love the episode. It's actually one of the most incredibly conceptually interesting episodes that was on that show. So, and we're not here exactly to create lists of idioms. Let's talk about what to do with idioms in fiction. Okay, so I think one of the main things is that because we have so many idioms in our own language, you kind of want to have them in fiction. If you're dealing with a fictional society that you've created, you don't want to leave the idioms out, right? So how do you go about creating idioms for a fictional world or a group of people? It's an interesting kind of question, because what I find is that sometimes they just pop out. I'll be right along and, oh my gosh, it just popped out. What the? Suddenly there was a proverb. Oh, wait a second. You know? Yeah, so for example, I just had that happen to me when I was writing chapter 3 of my new book, where it's really, so here we are, we're going along, and this woman is coming up to this guy and talking to him and saying, she's kind of propositioning him, actually. She says, oh, you know, I'd like to kiss you, and I'm up for more if you are. And then she launches into this expression, a rock roof is safer than a blanket. And I was like, why are you saying this? What did you just do? Right? Like, wait a second. Well, it's actually, I mean, I guess it just sort of, you know, it's one of those things that your subconscious goes, you need to say this here. So you will say this here, and you have no say in the matter. But of course, I'm like, oh, okay, let's take that and see if we can, you know, do more with it. So I actually ended up being able to use it in chapter 4 also. But it's an expression that this particular person finds relevant to her life, because she is a soldier who goes up on the surface, and when she's on the surface, she's in danger, right? And so she may be interested in propositioning people up there, but probably less likely, because a rock roof is safer than a blanket, right? So, yeah. Anyway. And it's not like, what is, I mean, okay, so if you ask what makes it idiomatic in that context, as opposed to just an actual statement of fact, because it kind of is true, but there really wouldn't be any reason for you to kind of explain safety to somebody if you were propositioning them. Sorry. The context of the whole thing is kind of cracking me up. But it's like, we're all, it's almost like the meaning of it is not so much about rock roofs versus blankets, but it's more about things are good, right? We're cool, we're safe, and we can, you know, we can take a chance together, or whatever it happens to be. Yeah, so that kind of surprised me. But I've also done things where I deliberately alter an earth expression so that it fits the Varan world. So things do not happen out of the blue in Varan, because that would make no sense at all. They happen out of the dark.
Yeah.
So basically what I'm doing with that one is I'm taking an existing expression and I'm saying, if there was no such thing as a blue sky, this is what it would sound like, and it would mean the same thing. The idiomatic meaning would transfer, i.e. it means something that happens completely unexpectedly, right? But you couldn't say out of the dark in our world because it would mean literally something coming at you out of the dark. It's not like, do you know what I'm saying? But because of the transfer, because of the different characteristics of the world, I can say that in context and have people go, oh, right, so this is what they say instead. And it's almost like, if you think about the way that somebody's going to comprehend that, it's actually kind of interesting. But they're going to sort of see it in a context that suggests the non-literal meaning. And then be able to reconstruct the fact that this is actually the idiom that they recognize with a piece different. So I trust my reader to do a lot of work for me.
The context is solid.
Sorry?
If the context is solid, then it's not so hard.
Yeah, exactly. The context supports it. And that's really important, actually. If you're going to be introducing a new idiom or altering an old idiom, you have to make sure that you have contextual support for what the meaning of that thing might be. Because you don't want people to go, and think, I'm so confused. Yeah. This world is too strange for me. I can't handle it. Right? Then you'd be like, okay, bye, reader. So, wow, that was an objecting kitty.
I know, right? I got an objecting.
So if you run across,
I protest.
if you're writing along, and you get to a place where, wow, Jay, you get to a place where you put in an idiomatic expression, and you suddenly look at that and you say, that's wrong, but you need an idiom there, then you have to think about what you're doing, go back and see what you can use given the context. Something that makes sense. And that's interesting because you need the story behind an idiom is a backstory, and it's not necessarily something that you've already thought of. You might have to stop and go back and say, okay, this makes sense in context to me, but I need to figure out where it came from. Where my I have to know it even if it's not obvious to the character who's using it. Because, what's the backstory of the cat out of the bag? I don't know. I know what it means, but I would have to look it up to see what the backstory is.
Yeah.
So, your character might not know what the backstory is, but you need to. Like a lot of world building, you have to know this stuff, and your characters don't.
Right. And you can have context. So, like, I was just thinking about spill the beans, which is one of the ones that occurred to me. But spilling the beans is something where even if you had beans in a secondary world, you probably wouldn't want to use it because its meaning is so firmly associated with when I hear it, I think of Chicago gangsters. Come on,
an old saying.
Right? And so if you have an expression that's really firmly associated with one particular context in our society, you're not going to want to transfer it, even if many of the ingredients that would be necessary for the expression are actually present in the other world, right? So what are you saying about feathers in the wind, Morgan? Tell me.
Well, it comes out of actually an old story about gossip, basically. And somebody said, how do I had some gossip go out. I said something, and it goes everywhere. And the rabbi, I think this is a story where I heard it, said, take a pillow, take a feather pillow, and open it up and scatter the feathers, because this is how it works.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go and pick that up? Every feather, recover it, bring it back. No, you can't, because that's done.
Yeah.
So Twitter is actually kind of like feathers in the wind.
Yeah.
It's never going away. You can't pick up the pieces, but that's an expression that comes out of that story, but most people aren't going to know the backstory of that.
Yeah.
But it also, I think, feathers in the wind, I don't know, can you figure that out, or do you need a context? I mean, if I explain it, you see what I mean. Twitter is like feathers in the wind. It makes sense as a phrase.
I heard that story in a movie,
Hmm.
but when I saw the expression "feathers in the wind," I did not remember or associate it. So maybe it's just one of those ones that it's sort of gone out of fashion.
Feathers in the wind.
Whereas
I didn't hear that. I came up with. That's my expression.
Okay.
That came out. That's something that I said that came out of that story. I think actually when I was thinking about Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
Because someone was saying, this thing happened and it wasn't me, but
maybe you can start one.
Hmm?
Maybe you can start an idiom.
Yeah.
And the meaning is obvious once you associate it with something like Twitter that people know about. The internet is forever.
Well, and I think that you have to do work in English to associate that with Twitter, but you don't have to do so much work that you're explaining the entire story, right?
Right.
You can say, well, gossip spreads like feathers in the wind, and then you're
done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And even though there is a sort of opaque part of it, it's not so opaque. Like it can, you can support it by letting it be a metaphor.
Yeah.
Right? With just that little bit more context, right? Because it stands up as a metaphor. You can get the scattering metaphor, right? And metaphor is part of a lot of these, actually, because a lot of it is like you're taking a situation and you're likening it to another situation via the idiom. I mean, that's a lot of what you're doing. So in a way, this is relevant to larger questions of metaphors and what kind of metaphors you might use in a secondary world.
And a metaphor might be closer to the source story than something like spilling the beans and cat out of the bag, where the closer you are to the story, the easier it is for someone to go back and say, oh, I remember what that means.
Right.
Where that came from. And the further you are from the story, either culturally or temporally, the more it works is, am I getting this backwards? The closer you are, the more like a metaphor it is, because you're closer. 2 cups of coffee isn't going to be enough to explain that. Remember which way I'm going. Geographically, culturally, well, geographically is culturally in this context, or temporally, the more it's going to be metaphorical because you see the story. Is that right, or is that backwards?
Well, metaphors are funny things.
They really are.
Some of them are opaque too. So, yeah. I mean, I think they're neighbors, I guess, in this whole thing. But I think that our capacity to understand metaphor can help us even when we don't understand backstory.
Yeah.
Right?
So I came up with one sort of proverb idiom one time, and it was for like a species. They were very predatory, and they ate their food raw. But they look sort of mostly like people, but not.
Yeah.
But what the thing I came up with, what they were saying was blood adds sauce to the meal.
Mm-hmm.
Was where it was sort of like the gorier, the better. They sort of, and I think it could probably be used for lots of things, and I think it stood out as being sort of very culturally specific, and
yeah. And it's interesting because you'd wonder if you were. It might mean something different if you said it to somebody inside the culture versus somebody outside the culture.
Yeah.
Right?
Because somebody outside could be the meal.
Well, that's true. But also, I mean, it might be an expression that when you used it between people who were parts of this society, they'd be like, oh, you know, the fresher it is, the better, the more delicious it is. Maybe that's all it means, right? But if you said it in front of somebody who was a cooked food eater, you know, blood doesn't flow when things are cooked.
Yeah.
Right? And so it might be like, oh, you know, you guys have no taste.
Right? You're doing it wrong.
And you know, it's funny because insiders and outsiders is something that I have talked about a lot before, but it is actually very relevant because it does change the meaning of things that you say. So, yeah. So I'm trying to think if there are some other ones that I could bring up. Let's see. Oh well, okay. So my favorite one, speaking of blood and predators, the favorite one that I had in Cold Words was only the scavenger does not expect to find his meat still struggling. Right?
Yeah.
That makes sense to me, just without, well, it makes sense to me. But you have to know what a scavenger is.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of explanatory, it's sort of self-explanatory in a sense. But the reason that it functions as an expression is because it's not being used to describe hunting. It's being used to describe somebody who likes to have everything neatly packaged for them, like in advance. They want the situation completely. So in that, this one is something that Ru Lee says when he's talking to the human Parker. And Parker has just explained that this linguist person who's come to their planet, her job is not to make deals or figure stuff out. Her job is to learn what she's been taught, go down, use it really well, work things out, and leave. Right? And this is Ruli's expression to signify how little he respects that aspect of her job. Right? And then the other one that they often use is, you know, whether your teeth are sharp enough. Are your teeth sharp enough for this fight? Right? It's basically, can you handle it? Right? So, yeah. So that kind of thing. They can have literal meanings, right? But they're used metaphorically or
Yeah.
with a different kind of larger scale meta implication.
I think like one of the one that's sort of literal is lay down with dogs and wake up with fleas. Because that's like literal, but that's not necessarily what it means.
Yeah.
Although that is perfectly plausible outcome.
Uh-huh. Yeah, this is why it's so linked to metaphor, really, because what you're doing is you're taking a whole situation and comparing it to a whole other situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if you lie down with dogs, you wake up with fleas. And possibly the plague. Just kidding.
Well,
sorry, Glenda.
why didn't you? Did you really expect you wouldn't get the plague?
Yeah.
Lie down with dogs.
Yeah.
Explaining that with the dogs and the fleas.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Possibly. So it's interesting.
Well, then there's like the words of wisdom, like ones that are stories to teach, like a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So they're also used to teach things too, or like just like life lessons, little compact life lessons, I guess.
In Proverbs, I think.
Yeah.
Actually, that reminds me of this is okay. So hang tight. I'm writing down two in the bush. I don't want to get distracted. I don't want to be like, and then push this. Anyway, yeah. Proverbs used to teach, and I think actually that's kind of an interesting one. One of the things, and I'm not even sure if this is idiomatic, but it's like if you have a story, and I don't even know if there's a story behind the expression. But anyway, so in Varan you have the Embati caste, which is the servant caste, right?
Mm-hmm.
And their whole ideal is to discover love and service, basically, right? And so they have an expression which is Embati, love where you serve, right? That is sort of like the canonical expression of my vocation kind of thing. But it's interesting, I think, to talk about where it gets used, right? They don't, like, sometimes they say it to each other literally, right? If somebody seems to be not relating to their vocation properly or whatever.
Yeah.
But in sometimes what they're doing is they'll use it ironically, right? Like to express that they're so frustrated with their current situation because they're not being treated well by their master or whatever it happens to be. And they'll just kind of throw up their hands and say, Embati, love where you serve, and it'll mean something like, well, can't do much about this, can I? Or, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how you can take a piece of language and it sort of starts making itself into something across contexts, right? Needing to know the story behind sour grapes. Yeah, it's helpful. It's helpful to know the story behind sour grapes.
Right.
I almost wonder if that's literal because, God, those things unripe are awful.
No. There's this whole story about, I think it's a fox.
Yeah.
And there are these grapes in a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
And he's trying to get the grapes out of the bottle. and he tries all these different things and can't get them out, and he finally gives up and says, well, they were sour anyway.
Yeah. So
and that's a very abbreviated version of the story. But
sour grapes, yeah. So sour grapes, if you're talking about it's sour grapes, it's more like somebody gave up on something and then started bad-mouthing it.
Yeah.
Right.
The story where I heard it was that the fox couldn't get them, but there was a bird that could, and the bird came down and got the grapes. So I think that may, apply to not just I can't get them, they were sour anyway, but I can't get them, somebody else did. And I don't know if that makes
maybe it's a sort of
different
thing.
Well, it is a sort of, semi, jealousy related saying, like.
Is that an Aesop's fable?
Yeah, it is.
yeah, that's what I couldn't think of.
Yeah, I have conflict over here.
Yeah.
Fox and the grapes.
Well, I mean, we reference Aesop's fables,
Is it? Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. There's one here. What I'm seeing here, one reference is that it is just a fox.
They're probably variants, Stories tend to pick up variants over time.
That's true. That's true.
Canonical stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, there might be a different expression for a two-character.
Yeah, but what's interesting, I think, is this idea that there are canonical stories has come up now 3 times. And I think that it's really important to think through what the canonical stories of whatever world it is that you're creating are. Are there religious canonical stories? Are there folk canonical stories that don't have anything to do with religion? These are important things to know, because if there are canonical stories, then you're going to have this kind of canonical imagery that's going to find its way into metaphors and expressions and various things like that. So that's something I thought of, and then it's trying to escape from me. Well, so I mean, this is one of the things that I like to try to play around with is like historical linguistics, because you'll have some event that occurs, and then people will tell the story of the event, and they will imbue it with a particular kind of moral message, right? And then thereafter, references to that event will actually be divorced from the context of the event itself and become all about the moral message.
Yeah.
So if you have something like that, it's kind of fun to play around with, So so for example, there's an event that happens in the back history of Varan, which is actually in my story in Clark's World called Soul's Bargain, right? And I wrote that event because, the reason I wrote that story was because it later becomes a core cultural concept for people who don't actually know about the original event. And so I was like, ooh, I could write about this original event. That would be really cool and fun, and I had a great time writing the story. But it's completely lost its original context by the time you encounter it in the books. So, yeah. Basically it's a cultural concept of reciprocity, right? and honesty. So, you know, and if you're a person who doesn't know what a soul's bargain is, that means nobody can trust you, right? Because you're not going to you're not going to be open enough with them for them to trust you. And you might not pay them back, right? You might not pay them back if they do you a favor, you might not pay them back. So, yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not the only one who likes to play with historical linguistics, but but it's fun to do, and idioms is the place to do it, really. Idioms and culturally important metaphors and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The boy who cried wolf. That's a good one, Glenda. Well done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Crying
I don't often find an actual place to put them, so I don't seem to ever really use them.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, that was why I suggested a while ago that you can find lists on ESL sites for inspiration. Maybe if you look at what some English idioms are that might not immediately have come to your mind.
Right. And also, you also have to think about whether a character is a proverb-using character, right?
Yeah.
It can happen. You can deliberately plan it. I think you can deliberately plan it. You can fall into it accidentally because you find yourself using an expression in English that really doesn't work in your secondary world, and then you have to kind of reconstruct something for yourself.
Right.
Right. Or you can kind of have a character who is a proverb-using sort of person, and that you just discover that they like to, pull out these old saws or whatever it is, and then, oh, wait a second, now I have to know what the old saws are.
Or where old saw came from.
Well, exactly. I have no idea where old saw came from. Anybody know that if there's a story behind old saw?
Man, I'm not even sure I've heard that one before.
Exactly.
It's different from old wives' tale.
Typical country folk that just everything's a saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's an old saw. Well, maybe it's an old saw because it might be old, but it's still useful. I mean, that's possibly, a literal old saw.
Yeah.
Could be. Or, well, I don't know. You'd know more about this, Juliet. If it wasn't, a saw, the tool that, the word that we know, if we hear the word saw, we know what it is, the tool. But if it meant something else, when the expression was first used, if it was a different word that made, I don't know enough about language to say
no,
where.
It's possible. It is possible. So if you're sitting there and you're trying to figure out what lies behind a particular idiomatic expression, going literal is a great way to approach it. But at a certain point, you can't tell if that was a saw or if it was actually something else. And sometimes you actually even will have instances where something, I'm trying to think. There's an example, but I can't think of it right now. So you'll have situations where something actually transfers across languages. And then in in one language it means one thing, but in the other language that's picked up in an idiom and imbued with a completely different meaning because they don't know the other language, so they're kind of back forming a meaning for this word that's been borrowed, basically. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens in language and language change, and you can mess around with it quite a lot.
Yeah. I bought an no, not old. Cost a pretty penny though for being a book like this thick, and unfortunately it's packed right now, and I have no idea or like any way of knowing how accurate it is. But it was a book I saw in a used bookstore. It's vintage, I guess. It's vintage. It was published in like the 50s or the 60s, and it's a book of like Japanese proverbs. And some are totally inscrutable. Like if you're if you're not Japanese. And then there was the one I can remember word for word is maidens like fish don't keep. And I thought that was absolutely hilarious, and I my family's like, well, I don't get it. What does that mean? And I'm like, oh my god, think about it for 5 minutes.
Think about it for 5 seconds. But then,
Che, what was the first word in that?
Maiden.
Maiden?
Yeah, here, I'll put it in the chat bar. Hopefully. Yeah, maidens like fish don't keep.
Just something about the value of a maiden.
Yeah,
I've heard visitors are like fish. They smell after 3 days.
Yes.
Yeah. The one Japanese expression that I hear most often quoted is the nail that sticks up gets hammered down.
Oh yeah, I think Westerners like that as like an example of what they think of as conformity being in Japan.
Yeah.
And I think they've somehow embraced it to sort of make this sort of monolithic conformist culture out of Japan. But
well, I mean, it's not as monolithic as all that, but
I know, yeah,
is valid.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of our squeaky wheel gets the grease, right?
Yeah.
If you're a squeaky wheel over there, you get told not to squeak.
Really?
Yeah.
So I wonder if you go back and look at this video, how many proverbs, how many idioms are just coming out of our mouths as we go through, as we talk. Old talk, pretty penny. What else have we said without noticing?
Yeah. Probably quite a number.
Noticed because we're discussing them, so.
Yeah.
It's like they're good examples, but.
I mean, you didn't think about saying pretty penny. You just did, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Or did you?
And that's the price of something. If you paid a pretty penny for it.
Yeah.
It
costs a lot. Yeah.
But why? I mean, it's obvious, but why is it a pretty penny?
Yeah.
What's the story behind that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. I just thought of another one that I used in Cold Words, which is he will give it to them with tail turned. Basically mean without looking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did
Which is different from another tail-related idiom would be turn tail and run.
Right, turn tail.
But that's different. It's a different meaning.
With tail turned versus turn tail.
Yeah.
And actually, okay, there's another one, and I think I must have had turn tail in my head at some spot. So Cold Words basically one of the things about it is it's full of this stuff, because I just went really deep into all the metaphorical kinds of underpinnings of this wolf society. They're not wolves, but you know, regardless, wolf-inspired society of aliens, and did a lot of stuff with metaphors. And so he's constantly using expressions like, you know, with tail turned, and the other one is, now my folly turns teeth and bites.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That would be like the less pretty, you know, something biting you in the ass.
Yeah.
Something dumb you did has come back to bite you in the ass.
Exactly.
Up to your ass and alligators.
Yeah.
Now that must be Southern.
Yeah. See, I know so many Southern and Texas ones.
Yeah.
Long-tailed cat in a room full of as nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. And,
That's
Wait,
awesome.
what's that one? What's that one about rocking chairs and rocking chairs and cats?
That's a good one. I've heard that one before.
I hadn't.
I was wondering what the room was full of. Cool. Well, it's actually 11:02, so we managed to complete our hour, which is pretty cool. Do we so next week, let's see. Next week is the first week of November. So we have time for a topic that's not a person. But the second week of November, we're going to have Nancy Hightower on the show, and that's going to be really cool. Because she's talking about her book of poetry called The Acolyte, and that'll be a really kind of fun thing to dig into, especially given what we were just talking about today with metaphor and you know, well, I don't know. I think poetry and metaphor and a sense of world are definitely all related, but in a slightly different way from just regular storytelling. So it'll be really interesting to see what she has to say. That one is going to be on the 11th of November, I believe. Oh, and I'm going to have family at home. Yay, that'll be interesting. Because I just realized it's a day off for everyone, but that's fine. No worries.
I'm probably going to miss on the 11th.
Okay.
I have to check my schedule, but I think I have a conflict.
All right. Yeah, that's not a problem. So next week, why don't we do titles, but like titles like Mr. or Mrs. and
Oh yes. I've been trying to find
titles. Because Morgan, I think you suggested that a while ago, and I had just not been able to get around to it. And then we did titles of books the other day, and then I was like, oh wait, we gotta do titles
People
of
titles.
As
people
in,
titles. So next week, at this time, we'll do people titles, and that should be kind of cool. All right.
Yes.
Sounds
I'm
good.
gonna stop the broadcast. Thanks for everybody who was listening.